sponsored by the Institute for the Study of Race and Culture. And my name is Alex Pearcey, and I currently have the honor to be the director of the Institute, which was founded and directed for many years by Dr. Janet Collins. I'd like to thank all of you for attending this evening, and I would have thanked the live stream fund, but we will get to that once the live stream is up and running. So the lecture series serves two equally important objectives. First objective is to acknowledge and honor the work of Dr. Anderson A.J. Franklin in all its many and varied capacities. This includes your work from civil rights leader to esteemed scholar, from community organizer to psychotherapist, from trailblazer of Black psychology to well-loved mentor, from radical activist to cherished ally, and for many others, a father, a husband, a brother, and a grandpa. Secondly, the lecture series is to provide a platform for lectures that both embody AJ's work and inspire and challenge us to continue the ever important and necessary fight against racism in all its dehumanizing forms. A fight that feels ever more urgent in our country as we experience significant rolling back of civil rights across many platforms, including race, gender, and sexuality, and abroad, where we see ongoing evidence of colonial occupation, unlawful annexation of land, and ongoing crimes against humanity. However, because you are attending and tuning in not to hear me speak, let me turn to this evening's agenda. Firstly, I would like to extend appreciation to our Dean, Stanton Worthy, for his ongoing support and investment in the Institute. I'd also like to convey appreciation to colleagues from the Department of Educational Counseling, Education and Developmental Psychology. Some of you are here today. I'd also like to thank members of our research team for your ongoing engagement and commitment to our work. And of course, I need to thank our coordinator, Jasmine, for her tireless efforts and also for her infectious enthusiasm. And clearly, last but not least, I'd like to thank our evening presenter, Dr. Joseph Carr. And thank you for your presence, Joe, and for what you'll be sharing with us this evening. But we're going to start this evening with what we did last year, present briefly here, AJ, of your work over the years, and then we'll turn over for our presentation. Thanks.
Revealing ourselves to therapists, reveals ourselves in a way that has racial implications for us. And particularly if we're going to counselors that are not Black counselors and not Black male counselors. So we feel that you will not only misunderstand us as a man, but you will misunderstand our experiences.
Well, for a while I've been talking about the sort of psychological consequences for Black men in particular that comes from the imposition of stereotypes and constantly being misrepresented and essentially made invisible by all the assumptions and presumptions that people have of us. A group of us marched on the Council of Representatives or some meeting being held by the APA Executive Board to protest the lack of representation of the Black experience in psychology, and kind of shut that whole meeting down. If we streamline the services, how policy can also be streamlined, can also be better.
And we find that that is much more effective to work as a coalition to try to address the issues of poor achievement in education, the lack of homelessness, instability of families. That working together as a coalition, as a partnership, has much better effectiveness for interventions. On February 1st, 1960, 4 students sparked the nationwide sit-in movement by sitting at the whites-only lunch counter at Woolworth's store in North Carolina. They became known as the Greensboro Four. Several weeks later, on February 22nd, 1960, 34 students were arrested for trespassing at Tolbheimer's department store. These students became known as the Richmond 34. I was one of them. We sparked similar sit-ins throughout the state of Virginia and in other places.
It's been nearly 6 decades since Richmond 34 challenged racism and discrimination during a peaceful protest. Recently, they realized that arrest was still on their record, but that changed today. Their case is now closed.
They used exceptional restraint to lead a peaceful protest against an evil system of bigotry and discrimination. However, they moved forward that day and made an extraordinary difference in the terms of the South segregated policies and practices.
Even in spite of the progress, that there's still many, many things that haven't changed. So the work is still there. The mantle and the torch is going to be passed.
I will also encourage you to look at the program and read through AJ's bio. You get more of a sense of his contributions over the years. So AJ, we thank you, and we honor you, and I believe we are all richer for who you are and for your life's work. Thank you. I would now like to invite Dean Will to provide a brief welcome and introduction of Dr. Joseph Connell. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone. We appreciate your being here. As Alex said, the Institute for the Study of Race and Culture was started by Dr. Jan Helms more than 2 decades ago, and we're grateful for her work in bringing it forward and leading it across 20 years or so. She was a colleague with AJ and made many wonderful contributions. And we're also very grateful that we have Alex Peters here as the director now to take over that mission and push the work of the Institute forward. It's central to the work that we do in the Lynch School that we in the Lynch School are trying to enhance the human condition, expand the human imagination, and make the world more just. That is our mission. And this work on race and culture, the role that it plays in counseling, in trauma, in schools and other contexts is central to what we do, and the Institute makes crucial contributions in those areas. So we're grateful to be able to host that institution within our school and excited to have Alex here working on it. We're also thrilled to be able to honor Dr. A.J. Franklin, that he was a valued colleague for many years in the school, a leader on the faculty, made wonderful contributions to the curriculum and the students with his research and his mentorship of many folks. He gave wise advice to me when I came as dean 8 years ago, appreciated his help then and all the things that he's contributed that Alex summarized so nicely. And we're thrilled today to have Dr. Joseph Gahn here as our speaker. Dr. Gahn is the faculty director of the Harvard University Native American Program. He's an expert in the psychology and mental health of American Indians and other indigenous peoples. He has collaborated with tribal communities for over 25 years to critique traditional mental health models and argue that they do not work with indigenous peoples and American Indians, and he's tried to harness traditional culture and spirituality as ways of trying to address mental health challenges and to bring flourishing to American Indians. He's a clinical and community psychologist and an action researcher. His academic work is very impressive. He's published over 100 scientific articles. He's won more than 20 fellowships and career awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship. He was an undergraduate at Harvard, a graduate student at the University of Illinois. He also is a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, and I learned of 7 different divisions of the American Psychological Association, so he's been honored with that award as well. Last year, he received a Gold Medal Award for Impact in Psychology from the American Psychological Foundation, and he's also an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. So Dr. Gahn, welcome.
It's really just a remarkable honor to have been invited to address you tonight, so thank you so much for this invitation. Thank you, Professor Peters, for reaching out and talking to me about this early on. And thank you, Dr. Franklin, for the inspiration you have brought to get this kind of a lecture going and in your honor. It's just amazing. And Dean Wortham, it's good to see you again. Thanks so much for a very kind introduction. I'm eager to share with you tonight about Indigenous historical trauma, which I frame and understand as alternative or alternative explanations for mental health inequities. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. Let me say first of all, however, that I am from Montana originally. I am a psychologist and interdisciplinary social scientist, and I hail from the Anahe tribal people of Montana. We reside on the Fort Leonard Indian Reservation in central Montana with our good neighbors, the Nakota Assiniboine people. On my dad's side, I come from the Azure and Brisbane families. On my mom's side, from the Guan and Crazy families. I carry my mom's surname, as you hear, and I always say it's a good thing she didn't hyphenate her last name. But I guess I call his name Dr. Guan Crazy. Accused of compliance. Let's see if this works. Fantastic. We're talking today about American Indians and Alaska Natives, of course. We are the surviving descendants of indigenous peoples in the United States. And anyone who gives a presentation about American Indians and Alaska Natives will always tell you how diverse we are, and there is a great deal of diversity. We have experienced a huge demographic rebound in this nation. There were 5 to maybe 10 million, depending on which demographers you talk to, prior to the arrival of Europeans to this hemisphere in what we think of as the United States. That really bombed out over the long period of colonial subjugation, European expansion, and so on, such that by 1890 there were only 240,000 indigenous peoples living in the United States. Since then, of course, our population has improbably and against all the odds really expanded. And so, as of the 2020 census, we had 3.7 million people identify as solely American Indian or Alaska Native. With, if you fold in folks who identify with more than one race, including American Indian or Alaska Native, you've got 9.7 million people. So between 1 and 2% of the population. Small percentage, of course, and yet a pretty sizable number given that we were advanced race for so long. We're organized typically into tribal nations, and so there were 570 plus federally recognized tribal groups. Those are folks who have, basically treaty relationships with the United States, and are nations within a nation, and there's a whole very special kind of status that accompanies federal recognition. Beyond that, there are also state-recognized tribal groups, and indigenous folks who come from other parts of Latin America, for example, who migrate to the United States. So there's large numbers of indigenous peoples, but in terms of tribal nations, 570 plus. And you're probably familiar with Indian reservations, which are our sovereign homelands, where many of us were fortunate to reside and to continue to visit or count relatives. But lots and lots of Native people live in urban population centers as well. So it's actually 70–80% live outside of reservation lands, although many have traveled back north. So it is kind of a circulation as well. Thank you. American Indians and Alaska Natives are colonized people, and so thinking about colonial subjugation or the condition of coloniality is really important. We were violently dispossessed of our lands, which is probably the most important thing to know about our history. And that violent dispossession entailed a great deal of deleterious community impacts. From not having resources that would sustain the way of life, and having our way of life actually assaulted in the name of civilizing the savages. And so the signature of all of this over time is what we can now recognize as behavioral health or mental health inequities. That's one way that the professional medical establishment counts our this legacy of colonial subjugation. And what's interesting, however, is that behavioral health problems, mental disorders, those sorts of things, are only one way to kind of account for and describe this colonial legacy. We have other indigenous or altered native explanatory accounts as well. And that is, in fact, what indigenous historical trauma argues up to relative to its conceptual confirmation. And so that's what I want to talk about really with you for this evening's presentation. Historical trauma is a term that really arrived into the scholarly record in the health and mental health fields in the 1990s. So you had the counseling psychologist Eduardo Duran, who wrote books starting in the 1990 actually, about what he called the soul wound of indigenous people. The idea that colonial subjugation had yielded this cascade of suffering that lent itself to some kind of counseling intervention in terms of trying to address. Shortly thereafter, along the parallel track, a social work researcher, Maria Braveheart, talked about historical trauma. And so this was the way this language was first deployed to capture what we now recognize as historical trauma. There have been subsequent refinements and elaborations since then. It's been decades at this point. And historical trauma has been pretty heavily promoted by indigenous health scientists and professionals, especially in the behavioral health domain, not only, but predominantly in mental health. And probably more importantly, it's been taken up by indigenous community members. So everywhere you go, throughout Indian country, as we say, or even indigenous circles in the former British Commonwealth nations like Canada and Australia, you can hear people talk about historical trauma as well. So it is really resonated and found purchase in everyday community life as well. What is historical trauma? I mean, I think you can understand that it weds two pretty familiar concepts: historical oppression, which many people talk about for a very long time, and psychological trauma. So you take historical oppression and psychological trauma, you put it together, and you get the concept of historical trauma. And part of what led to Maria in particular coining this term and applying it to indigenous suffering were these kinds of aspirations and potential factors. First, of course, was the emergence of PTSD and its authorization to inclusion in 1980 in the DSM-3, so it became an official diagnostic category to have post-traumatic stress and dysfunctions associated with that. That opens up, all kinds of conceptual possibilities around trauma that didn't exist prior to that in that same way. In addition, Maria was trained as a social work researcher and social work practitioner, and so learning counseling and therapy and trying to figure out how do you adapt and make sense of counseling and these sorts of approaches with based on what I call scientific knowledge. I'll explain that later in terms of why I use that particular way of framing it. But how do you apply this knowledge effectively with indigenous peoples often who come from histories of subjugation, as I've said, but also cultural difference in some important ways. So this quest to be culturally competent or figure out what to do with these approaches is part of it. She trained in part with Jewish psychoanalysts in New York City. She trained in Columbia. And so she learned from them got this term, historical trauma, as they were applying it to the descendants of survivors of the Shoah, the Holocaust. And so part of what they were talking about was Holocaust survivors themselves, are grappling with the traumas they experienced, but their offspring also apparently were suffering from after effects, sort of. It was hard to explain or understand how those came about, but they referred to historical trauma in this intergenerational fashion between survivors and descendants. And so that became a part and parcel of what historical trauma tries to reference. And of course, in the 1990s, we had the Columbian Quincentennial, and so there was a lot of thinking and talking about what was the legacy of Columbus, what has it meant for indigenous peoples. It was a time when indigenous issues were kind of very important in the broader American society, and that played a role as well. So historical trauma has, been coined originally as a form of complicated PTSD, complex post-traumatic stress, or intergenerational kinds of trauma. It's been elaborated in lots of ways. There is no one definition. There's no one way to apply it. But a common way that historical trauma is differentiated from something like personal trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder are what my former student, Will Hartman, and I refer to as the 4 C's of indigenous historical trauma. It originates in colonial injury. So it's not really appropriate to apply it if, there's an act of God, so to speak, a forest fire, an earthquake. It's really about, interpersonal subjugation through the process of colonization, historically. It's collectively experienced, which is to say it's not really about an individual, it's not in like medical fashion, a patient's diagnosis in that way, because it's understood to be shared. It's cumulatively escalating, which is to say that there are waves of policy and practice that expressed European and Euro-American subjugation of indigenous peoples. And so it might be the military chasing you around and massacring you at one point, but then capturing you and locking you on a reservation, promising you rations, but food doesn't show up, you starve, you get subject to disease, and that disease, you're struggling to live, and the kids are taken away and put into repressive government-run boarding schools that were designed to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. So waves of things happening in a way that can accumulate over time. Finally, it's understood to represent a cross-generational transfer. And it's grounded and oriented on ancestral suffering that somehow gets passed down to current generations and maybe future generations if we don't do something about it. And the particular mechanisms are up for debate. Some people talk about spiritual kinds of things. The soul wound is meant to kind of capture that. Others will talk about epigenetics. Just different ways, though, that the legacy of ancestral trauma puts future generations at risk or more vulnerable to, above and beyond their traumas they personally might experience. So one thing that my former students and I did was to try to do a systematic review of what we learned about historical trauma for indigenous communities in the United States and Canada in terms of health outcomes. And so we really looked at statistically analyzed empirical research studies. There's a lot of work that's more conceptual, but we were trying to focus on what people had actually assessed in terms of data collection and so on. And so it was drawn on indigenous samples from the United States and Canada. And they had these studies to be included in the systematic review, had to explore associations between indigenous historical trauma measured in some fashion and health outcomes measured in some fashion. So pretty broad, but an effort to really see how they linked up. And we tried to deliberately construe this quite broadly because we wanted to include all the studies, we wanted both studies, not necessarily. So what we found in this particular systematic review was that there were 32 empirical articles that had assessed and in most cases found clear links, associations between some measure of historical trauma and some health outcome. And in fact, we were able to categorize these into 3 different classifications based on the kinds of measures they used, essentially. So the most frequent and prevalent kind of study involved historical loss measures developed by Lestwicek and colleagues. This is a pair of scales, a historical loss scale, losses scale, which asks, how often do you think about loss of your land, loss of your culture, loss of spirituality, the toll of lost loved ones, those kinds of items, and from never to several times a day. like the Richter scale. And then the historical losses associated symptom scale then asked, after you had recorded results from historical losses, when you thought about those losses, how often did you feel angry, distressed, questions about feelings and emotional states and symptoms. And so you could get a score on both of these, and this is the main way that these studies then try to assess, and then you can take some measurements, score it in some way, and then simply do a statistical analysis of whether it correlates with higher rates of PTSD symptoms or depressive symptoms or things like that. And those were the kinds of findings that were reported in research. A second way of operationalizing or trying to capture this idea of indigenous historical trauma was what were called residential school ancestry studies. So these were mainly in Canada. There was one in the US, but mainly in Canada. And the idea here was that you could ask respondents, did you have a parent who went to residential school? Or did you have a grandparent who attended residential school? And this was yes, no, and then based on that binary, you could group people and then go ahead and see if the people who said yes, they did have an ancestor in residential school, are more likely to report symptoms of distress and those sorts of things. And indeed, they often did. Then there were three other studies that kind of resisted this classification. Two of them were by Maria Delbert-Spraycroft herself, which were the original studies of trying to test out intervention to help Lakota people grapple with historical trauma. It didn't actually measure historical trauma, but it did pre-post kinds of outcomes after kind of psychoeducational brief sort of support intervention. There's one other that operationalized historical trauma as whether you had family members who went on relocation, which was a program of the Bureau of Indian Affairs from the 1960s. So in terms of what we could make of these findings from these 32 studies then, what we really found was it was pretty hard to have knowledge accumulated in this domain because of the way that these different studies used these measures. So operationalizations are sometimes a bit flawed. For example, one study, might ask, did you have a grandparent who attended residential school? You can kind of make sense of that. But another study might say, did you have a grandparent or any elder in your community attend residential school? So, okay, that is very different than having a direct ancestor, if any elder, because lots of our communities have elders who attend residential school. And so that really changes what you're actually assessing, and you might wonder if that's actually getting at how historical trauma has been formulated to be passed down generationally, if it could be any elder in your community. So maybe that's not the best way to do it, and it makes it hard to know how you compare findings from that to findings from and those are kind of examples of sort of methodological idiosyncrasies. Another one was that many of the studies that used Wickett scales would collapse some of the items, use fewer items, not all 12 of them, or change the response, reverse the response, or use fewer responses. And Whitbeck never said how to score these or how to interpret scores. So you can get lots of findings that show associations, but they're using slightly different ways of measuring, and so it's hard to know. So unfortunately, what we were able to determine from these 30 studies is you don't really know what to make of it because they're kind of messy, complicated findings sometimes on top of these sort of idiosyncrasies, which means that the knowledge just doesn't really accumulate. So what we reasoned here is if you want to embark in a more scientifically robust assessment and analysis about whether indigenous historical trauma impacts health and the ways in which it does so, you've got to address some of these methodological limitations. For one thing, again, part of the problem is that the conceptual stuff is not entirely agreed on, so we need to come to some consensus, or someone needs to have a more robust sense of how to proceed in terms of that conceptual way. And then measure it really well and tightly, such that knowledge can start to accrue. And that's what's going to happen if you want to know scientific terms the answers to some of these questions. One challenge, however, is that indigenous historical trauma as a construct seems to have an appeal which is sort of extra scientific. Yes, it enters into the scientific world in these ways that I'm talking about. 32 studies have done things with these different two main ways of operationalizing it, but mostly people are using it irrespective of that. They're using it as kind of a discourse, a way of explaining and accounting for indigenous suffering in broad terms, ways of talking about and invoking colonial subjugation with respect to health. And doing so in a way that's quite expansive to all indigenous people. There's not really been much of an interest that we can see in this literature of trying to create historical trauma profiles based on individual response. We can look back to their ancestors and try to recover and recapture what was that ancestral suffering specifically, and then how does that differ from the ancestral suffering of their neighbor, say on the reservation. No one's really done that. Which suggests that they're not necessarily so interested in that element of it. Really, it's all of us are, heirs to historical trauma, and it shapes our consciousness and perhaps shapes our health in ways, and we don't need to necessarily refine it any more deeply than that. So it raises sort of an interesting question. If there is kind of limited interest in the scientific elements of kind of causal sorts of relationships between ancestral suffering and being passed down in some way to compromise the health of current and future descendants, what is going on here? What really are the functions? What is historical trauma achieved? And I've thought about this and tried to identify several of these for us. So one is that it explains American Indian and Indigenous behavioral inequities. It's a way of talking about and making sense of our suffering today that, of course, is not victim blaming in the way that we might otherwise if we just say you have mental disorders. And diagnosing with mental disorders, okay, then you're a patient who is diseased or distressed or dysfunctional in some way. So it provides, obviously, an alternative to that. And in doing so, it's really re-socializing American Indian community behavioral health problems. When indigenous people have talked to me about these kinds of problems, they don't talk about genetic predispositions, they don't talk about maladaptive biochemistry, they don't even really talk necessarily too much about psychodynamics or even early childhood family stuff. They really talk about colonial subjugation and the legacies of colonization. And so that is a kind of a radical re-socialization of mental health endeavor with respect to this sort of history and oppression. It affects destigmatization of these conditions by emphasizing shared suffering. So it's not you're a bad, flawed, deficient, defective person. That actually all of us are dealing with this, and together we can figure out what to do, how to move forward, how to engage in anti-colonial kinds of activities instead of carrying a diagnosis and feeling totally helpless and demoralized by that. It helps to legitimate American Indian healing traditions. This is part of what Rita was up to with the original intervention. Certainly there was plenty of grief intervention, psychological kinds of approaches, but she also had the tears kinds of stuff, which is a cultural and ceremonial approach. So from its inception, it's been about trying to help incorporate, legitimate, and make salient and recognizable the indigenous therapeutic approaches that might be brought to bear on this form of suffering. It trades on the currency of trauma discourse for claims making. So one thing we know about trauma, psychological trauma may be jump from physical injury to psychic wounding in the 1860s in Great Britain when there were railroads, careening around, sometimes wrecking. And a rail car would wreck, people would stumble off, and they would talk about symptoms that no doctor could identify anything wrong biologically or neurologically with them. And so the question was, are these biological symptoms or psychological symptoms? And it mattered because people were saying, I can't even work, and so I'm owed something by the railroad company for my suffering. And in fact, psychological trauma in every instance is really tied up in questions of claims making. Obviously, it entered the DSM-3 through the Vietnam War and Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and an activist effort by the DSM committees to try to get PTSD legitimated. They were successful. But that's tied up in whether veterans can get disability benefits. And so trauma goes hand in hand with claims making, and so that's always been part of it as well. And I think that it's useful often for communities who don't have resources or access to legitimacy to harness the claims making function in the way that it does. It taps into healthcare services and resources. So, as you all know, the revolution is not going to be funded by the government, right? I mean, any kind of like effort to change the inequitable status quo, is going to run short of resources potentially. Healthcare, on the other hand, is something the government will fund, and so it rides this interesting boundary. It's re-socializing things. It's trying to make sure that it's not just a medical problem, and yet it also is talking about health and medicine and medical because that's what the resources are. So trying to like keep it in play within the medical domain, I think, is very important in terms of the ability to access services and resources. It expresses what we can call survivance in the health domain. Survivance is a neologism that was coined by the Anishinaabe intellectual Joe Wisner, who was a postmodern literary theorist, is a postmodern literary theorist and a novelist. But he took the two terms survival and resistance and put them together to sort of say this is what has ensured the persistence of indigenous peoples against all odds, and again, in the way I talked about earlier. And so survivance is not only about persisting, it's also about persistence through resistance, which is in some ways, in contrast to say a concept like resilience, not just bouncing back to some status quo, but actually recognizing and calling out the status quo as not the appropriate, equitable, fair to even bounce back to. So it's resisting something about the status quo in the process. And so survivance is an effort that needs to be taken by indigenous peoples in the health domain and indigenous people as a way of trying to make that happen. It represents a contribution by indigenous scholars to health research. It's not unimportant in the scholarly world to have something to contribute and have something that's regarded. And so, there's a dozen or 20 scholars who have been able to make contributions to the sciences with reference to this particular construct. And finally, I've spent some time trying to systematize the way in which historical trauma anchors what I refer to as the alternative behavioral health discourse. Everywhere I've gone in my entire career in Indian country, people have had things to say about mental health and behavioral health that is not professional knowledge, that actually, in many instances, directly contests and aims to recast what we might think of as knowledge about suffering and healing and those sorts of things. And so I've taken to refer to this as an alternative science of behavioral health. So alternative science, what am I doing with this term science? It's not SCI, PSY. And so what I'm trying to do here is to recognize, despite the aspirations of psychiatry and psychology and most of our health professions, to try to anchor and ground clinical practice on scientific data, scientific outcomes, and so on, that in actuality, so much of what we inherit from psychiatry and psychology and social work and all the sciences, the psi disciplines, psychology, psychiatry, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, right? What we inherit from the psi disciplines is a body of knowledge that, yes, some of it probably is justifiable on some empirical grounding, but a lot of it's not. And a lot of it never can be, just like what you do in practice and those sorts of things. They're more like what you're trained in, how it's passed down. No one is really doing RCTs on every little thing that you do in a counseling endeavor. No one ever could. So my point is that there's a body of knowledge that's authorized by virtue of professional practice that goes beyond empirical foundations. And that's what I'm referring to when I get at this idea of science, which is to say that professional knowledge about psi matters is culturally relative and historically contingent. That is, it's a product of a time and place, and a different time and place will probably see a different product. And of course, when you go around the world, can have different views and understandings. So, with respect to this alternative science of behavioral health, just trying to track some domains and do some comparisons. The domains I listed here are distress, well-being, treatment, and evaluation, which seem to matter at any kind of scientific endeavor of this psi discipline variety. We could add other domains like training, and there's a lot of ways you can wrap this up. For the night, let's talk about distress. Really, in terms of this alternative approach, the interest is not in mental disorders, not in DSM-style kinds of conditions, but rather historical trauma in the way that it is sort of unpacked it and explained it. That historical trauma is what we need to characterize and to understand suffering in indigenous communities that assigned disciplines might be able to remedy. Now, well-being is something that's never all that articulated even by health professionals. That's that tacit often implicit. We study disorders, diseases, symptoms, dysfunctions, and we just assume that you're well if you remedy for some of those things. But there is a tacit kind of understanding of well-being, and I think in this alternative science, the tacit is not deal with the individualism, the kind that might be familiar in suburban America, which is, I guess you could say, free agents navigating free markets in pursuit of wealth and happiness. That's not really what most Native people are starting to and thinking about. Rather, indigenous relational selfhood. Forms of self-configuration that are sociocentric, that are maybe distributed outside of individuals to family, kin, to non-human relatives, sometimes to lands and territories. It's an expansive idea of the self in which who one is and what one is about is very directly and importantly anchored to one's relationships to others. When it comes to treatment, there's not been too much interest when I travel around Indian country in the latest, greatest evidence-based practice or empirically supported treatment. In fact, this is what people are most likely to say: we don't need the latest, greatest from outsiders. Our culture is our treatment. What people have told me throughout my career. And what that, I think, means, in part at least, is that there's some interest in reclaiming and revitalizing indigenous traditional healing practices. That our therapeutic traditions may be just as beneficial for the problems that we contend with, which are usually described as addiction, trauma, suicide. So, these aren't like Alzheimer's disease or schizophrenia that are inequities in indigenous communities. It's addiction, trauma, suicide. And when it comes to addressing those, people are confident that ceremony and sacred practices and traditional healing can be useful. How do we know? Well, this is the fourth domain, evaluation. What works? Well, we're not that intrigued or interested in what scientific outcome studies have to report about these matters. We're pretty skeptical that you can really scientifically study these things. They certainly don't want sacred things studied scientifically in most ways. Rather, indigenous ways of knowing what people talk about in terms of their interest in knowing whether something works. And, this is burgeoning. We can find attention to indigenous ways of knowing from indigenous studies in particular. A big part of it is like stories and narrative and those kinds of approaches, and various forms of qualitative inquiry that lend themselves to exploring and explaining storytelling and narrative. But one thing that I might nominate as a form of indigenous way of knowing, in indigenous epistemologies, we might say, there's diversity, of course, but would be the really veneration for first-hand experience. The highest thing you can say is, well, I experienced this, and here's what it was like, and here's what it meant. And the way elders would sort of really talk about those kind of things with young people, for example, would be in a monologue and a kind of roundabout, often metaphorical way. Because I think if we would nominate universals for indigenous cultural practices, one would be a protection of people's personal autonomy. You just don't push in, you don't intrude, you don't direct. They used to say, for Indian counseling, don't look people directly in the eyes. Indirection is important, both in speech and in interpersonal interaction. And that's back to this protecting personal autonomy. There's something to that, actually. So with personal autonomy, you don't tell other people what to do. And so this kind of elder speech that I'm describing, which is roundabout and it's more personal and it's just as an experience, then you leave it to the person who hears it to make use of it. However, it makes sense for the person to make use of it in their own personally autonomous fashion. It may be 20 years when the light goes on. That's what he was telling me. Now I understand because I now have the record. At any point, in any case, the point is the indigenous way of knowing scientific accuracy. So this has to do then with how historical trauma fits in, but also I think anchors a completely contrasting, particularly recasting psychological, psychiatric knowledge as usual, and saying there's a different way to this. Thank you. And ultimately then, I think one thing that I take from it, as an applied psychologist and tries to think about what we can do to help folks who are suffering, is that it affords a kind of expansion of therapeutic possibilities for people. The evidence-based practice movement, the interest in peer-based treatments, in some ways about narrowing practice. It's about really, finding out what truly works and trying to get clinicians and counselors to only do that stuff. And there's grounds and rationale for why that makes sense for a particular frame of reference. But I think that, when it comes to issues of what used to be called cultural competence, what is described as culturally sensitive kinds of therapeutic work, that's really a push to expand therapeutic practice, to find new ways and better ways to do things, not to narrow up to even fewer ways. And so I think that part of what this endeavor is doing, part of what Indigenous Historical Trauma is up to, is about making a license for expansions of therapies. And often the way it does this is to hook on to the colonial encounter and to recognize that a lot of Indigenous suffering can be talked about and framed within what we might call post-colonial anonymity. Anonymity means loss of, it means no law. In psychological terms, it means kind of a loss of identity, purpose, what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to live. It's a very deep disorientation that the colonial encounter resulted in for many, many peoples. And so the idea of animism, in which because you're disoriented, you can end up drifting into substance use and abuse, and that can lead to all kinds of other related problems. And so a big part of the therapeutic endeavor in Indigenous communities entails a reclamation of robust cultural identities that are proud and more knowledgeable and understandably beneficial. And part and parcel of that reclaiming of one's Indigenous identity in a healthy way can entail a return to Indigenous traditional practice. So I put traditional in quotes, of course, because tradition is always on the move, tradition is always being made and remade to be useful for today. So we're not talking about going back to some pristine something or other from 500 years ago, but we are talking about finding some kind of continuity with something in the Indigenous past and really pulling together and making it useful for today. And this is, I think, what people mean when they say culture. Our culture is our treatment. That culture as treatment can be understood to be engaging in these dynamics, to be remedying anonymity, to be rehabilitating identity, and to affording access to traditional practices, which can be therapeutically beneficial for a bunch of reasons. And so when people talk about decolonizing healthcare, this is an example of the kind of thing that might well mean decolonizing healthcare. Well, so I got a chance to share some ideas with you. My last name is English in Bond, as I said. My great-grandfather went to government boarding school when he was 5 years old in 1891. And the custom at that time is you take an Indian child's father's Indian name, and that becomes their surname. And his father's name was Gondowar, so it's clipped to God, and so we've been calling him ever since. He's called Frederick. So Gondowar is like this, just to explain what on the website has. But the point is, I try to make my research and publications widely available. I'll probably get in trouble at some point for it, but I try to. So a lot of it's here if you want to access as much of this as you can. But let's transition into dialogue or exchange or whatever we have time for now. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Such wonderful, challenging ideas asking us to rethink even the foundations of what we need to be mental health. Joe, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to gone.org to access some of the information. I'm now going to invite Adrian to come up and share some comments with us before we break for our reception.
Well, good evening to everybody, and I want to thank once again Boston College, the Dean, Alex Previously, for extending this great honor to name a lecturer. It's a little hard getting used to Anderson A.J. Franklin Unity Against Racism lecture, so it is indeed an honor. I like to think I'm a humble person, and I don't ever take everything for granted. Certainly when we talk about this issue of racism, it's something that has been very dear to my heart as a researcher, as a professional in terms of my career, but also personally in so many different ways. And listening, I really want to extend my appreciation to Joe Kahn, who I've known in different settings in the past. But he really takes me back to some of the earlier days in which this whole issue of understanding racism and inequities was embraced by the National Institute of Mental Health. And there was a push to understand the vast diversity of experiences that contributed to not only the inequities, but the outcomes. And there was an effort to fund African American mental health centers, Hispanic mental health centers. There was a Native American center by the National Institute of Mental Health to broaden an effort on the part of the government to explore the impact of racism, inequities, diversity upon different populations. And it reminds me that understanding racism, much less unifying against it, is understanding that it is extremely complex, not only in terms of its etiology, but also in terms of its process as well as its implementation and outcomes. And therefore, it does require having a collective effort, a unification of many different disciplines, many different policymakers, many different community sectors to address this issue. And I really appreciate this Unity Against Racism initiative because it brings such diverse thinking. I can just remember sitting in so many different, you really couldn't call on meetings because we would assemble in so many different venues just to talk about this kind of issue and to engage in transformative thinking about what is the impact of inequities, of disparities, of basically racism upon different populations, and how do we come to understand the vast impact that it could have upon populations. It certainly takes me back to my experience with the United Nations World Conference Against Racism. I guess it's 2001 now. And a delegation, 6 of us from the American Psychological Association, spent 2 weeks lobbying with different NGOs, as well as lobbying all the state members of the United Nations who were gathered in Durban, South Africa at that time to understand, for them to understand how their often political and economic policies had health implications. Because at that time, there was really no discussion about how many of the economic and political and policy discussions at that time actually had health consequences, much less mental health consequences. And so I feel that this effort of the Unity Against Racism lecture makes a contribution towards that objective, to continue the dialogue, continue to bring in people who are doing such great work like Joe Kahn is, and to share with us the complexity of this issue called racism and the outcomes from it. So I applaud Boston College, I applaud Alex Priestley and the Institute and the Dean for all of the efforts to make this happen. I look forward to it continue to happen in a lot of different ways. hopefully I will be able to be here for, future lectures, and get a chance to see many of you. And as I tend to say these days, particularly to my grandchildren, the torch is passed. There are so many of us of my generation who are just simply not around. My heart was moved looking at some of the people who co-authored things with me who just simply are not around anymore. And so it is now up to your generation to deal with the realities of racism and disparities that exist in the world today, and to take the leadership in whatever way that you can, both personally, professionally, and otherwise, even in just helping your children to understand being in the world, to take that torch and carry that torch high. And I look forward in the great beyond, when I get to transition, or as they say in my church, when I go on to glory, be able to look back and see, work well done. So thank you again for this opportunity.
So this concludes the proceedings for this evening. I would like to again thank Joe Long. I will share some inside information. When I was thinking of putting the lecture together, consulting with the advisory board, as I tend to do sometimes, I ran ahead of myself and then decided, why not consult with AJ? This is, after all, his lecture. And AJ and I had some discussions, and we thought, that we want to offer AJ to kick off the lecture series with a lecture. But of course, I had already asked Joe to do the first lecture, and then I went back, and he was so gracious. And I can tell you, Joe, waiting a year for your lecture it's been well worth it. So thank you so much for the insights you shared with us this evening. We appreciate it. So please, we have some refreshments. Please mingle. AJ and Joe will be here standing. Thank you very much.